A few years ago, I was in the middle of a very difficult time. My marriage had just ended, and my whole world was suddenly in flux. And I was profoundly sad. It was during this time when two of my oldest girlfriends dropped everything going on in their lives to come to see me. And in the middle of the lowest place that I've ever been, they sat on my couch, they took me dancing, they made me laugh with embarrassing stories from high school. And when they were leaving, I gave them a big hug and I said, "Thank you so much for being here." And they both responded by essentially saying some version of course, where else would we be? And they acted as if it was obvious that they were just going to get on a plane and come see me when I needed them. But the reason I was so touched is because it feels like that level of showing up for one another is something that we don't see as often these days. And that tracks with the data. A 2021 survey found that Americans report having fewer closer friendships than they once did. And in 2023, a Pew Research study found that 8% of Americans said that they have no close friends at all. When I was a kid, my grandparents lived next door, and I was forever showing up at their house, always unannounced, to hang out in their living room and eat from their fridge. And nowadays, I make an appointment to call my dad. I'll send him a text and I'll say, "Are you around tomorrow at 3 p.m.?" And he gets so frustrated because he's like, "I'm retired. What is this? Just pick up the phone." The point here is that something has happened to us. Around the globe, we are more technologically connected than ever before, and yet we're becoming lonelier and more isolated all the time. In 2024, Gallup did a global measure of loneliness where they found that 1 in 5 people, 23%, said that they felt lonely, quote, a lot of the day yesterday. Generation Z is experiencing the highest levels of loneliness, with around 80% reporting feelings of isolation over the past year, compared to 72% of millennials just the generation before, and 45% of baby boomers feel lonely. So, what this data demonstrates is that the assumption that loneliness is the problem of old age turns out to be inaccurate. It's young people who are suffering the most. And naturally, we should be asking ourselves why. Why have we become so lonely and isolated? There's a number of ways to answer that question. Obviously, we tend to prefer to engage with our phones instead of each other. Front porch has given way to back deck. The corner shop has become a drive-through. It's interesting. We look at what's broken in our world and we want our politicians to fix it. But by the time something truly needs fixing at the policy level, the rot has usually been decades in the making. The truth is, we are lonelier because somewhere along the way, we stopped caring about each other as much. And when we stopped showing up for each other and caring about each other in our personal lives, it was only a matter of time before we start to see that same dynamic playing out in society more broadly. This week, I was heartbroken to hear about the further dismantling of the 1965 Voter Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was an extremely hard-won response to racism in the South. It made the political process more equal on paper, but the mentality that made the Voting Rights Act necessary wasn't addressed in the legislation. And so here we are again, fighting the same battles in the same state houses that we did 60 years ago. We should all care about that. But I will say this is not a political sermon. This is a sermon about how the pain we see on the surface of our world is a symptom of a deeper disease. The symptom is the visible sign. The disease is the underlying condition that's creating it. And if you only address the symptoms, you never cure the disease. Last year, I talked about the spiritual disease of hate, which is obviously doing enormous damage in our world. Today, I'd like to go down a level and encourage us to think about, where does all that hate come from? There's the symptoms, the cruelty we see everywhere. There's the disease, hate. And now we need to be asking ourselves, what is the root cause of that disease? The answer the Course gives is that our disease of hate is being driven by the ego. And if you lift the hood to see what's powering the ego, what you discover is that it's an all-consuming sense of self. Not your true self, obviously, not your capital S self, your Christ self, however you want to phrase it. The ego is the all-consuming I in our mind that says, me and my needs, those are the only things that matter here. So if the ego is this selfish selfhood, then naturally the world the ego builds when it's in charge would be a world organized around the self, around the individual need, individual comfort, and individual survival. And isn't this exactly what we see when we look around us? It's very much worth noting that perhaps the most significant cultural shift in the last century has been the steady movement away from collective values towards individual values and the focus on the self. And as we've moved from the collective we to the all-encompassing I, we've moved towards the ego as the organizing center of our world. You can see this shift in how conversations have moved from shared norms to self-care. We're less guided by questions like what is right and what is true. And we're more guided by questions like, how does this make me feel? And what do I need right now? As I was working on this talk, I kept thinking about my grandfather and his generation. My grandfather was a Marine. I don't think he ever had a bubble bath in his entire life. He never talked about self-care. He didn't really take care of himself. I would have had to have been in pretty bad shape for him to ask me how I felt. And I'm not saying that that's the ideal, but I am pointing out that those were different times. A more concrete example than my grandfather's bubble baths is that in 2012, researchers used Google Books to track word frequencies across millions of American books throughout the 20th century. They published the results in the Journal of Positive Psychology, and what they found was a steep decline in the use of moral terms like virtue, kindness, and helpfulness. Those words appeared less and less, while at the same time, there was a rise in words associated with the individual ability to deliver, words like discipline and dependability. So we've gone from love your neighbor to put your oxygen mask on first. I learned about this study from author and former New York Times columnist David Brooks, who talks about this cultural shift from we to I a lot. And one of the things that he said on this idea is that we tend to live our lives from resume virtues versus eulogy virtues. Resume virtues center around individual achievement. These are the things that our culture tends to reward, but a meaningful life is built on eulogy virtues. And those have to do with the formation of character. Do you want someone standing up at your funeral and saying she was so good at protecting her energy, she really knew how to put herself first? Or do you want them to say, when I was having a hard time, she dropped everything and showed up for me, and I will never forget it? We know in our bones that the best things that we do in our lives are the things we do for other people. And yet we've built a culture that is embedding in us the opposite right now. And that gap where we're no longer looking out for what's best for everyone and we're centered on ourselves, that gap has a huge cost. The cost is that we lose common standards, which we're seeing playing out in our politics right now. When you do it, it's wrong and should be punished. When I do it, of course it's right. We see the cost in the loss of shared expectations. I don't even give you the benefit of the doubt anymore that you're going to do the right thing. We see the cost in our trust, our lack of trust in each other. This is where we start buying guns and building bunkers in our garages. But worst of all, we see the cost when we lose the ability to call each other to something higher. From Jesus to Gandhi to King to Mandela and beyond, every moral advance in human history has depended on people being able to stand up and say, we can do better than this. We have to do better than this. But we can only do that if we believe there is a we. When we lose that sense of shared self, that sense of we shrink into the I, and then the ego becomes our guide. And the Course says that when the ego is our guide, we become more depressed, which we're seeing now. Depression rates have doubled in the past decade. And when the ego is our guide, we become meaner, which we're also seeing. Nearly half of US adults say the way we behave in public now is ruder than it was before COVID. You might expect that this is where spirituality would step in and be the counterweight to all of this, that spirituality would be the force that pulls us back towards one another and back towards something higher than ourselves. And in some ways it has been, but in other ways, spirituality has just jumped on the bandwagon. The very same current that carried us from we to me has been running through our spiritual lives too. Conventional spirituality helps us care for ourselves, helps us feel better, and that's not nothing. God knows we need to feel better these days. But feeling better isn't becoming better, and I think we've confused the two. In his book, New Seeds of Contemplation, Thomas Merton said, you should only trust that something is truly spiritual, that it's truly of God, if it pulls you upwards towards something higher. And by that standard, I do think it's worth asking ourselves if modern spirituality has been pulling us higher, or has it mostly been pulling us inward? Earlier, I pointed to some of the markers that tell us that culture at large has made this shift from the collective to the individual. The front porch giving way to the back deck, virtue language in our books being replaced by language of independence, our phones being our concern more than our connection with one another. And if you look closely at contemporary spirituality, you can see this same trend. You can see it in how we describe the spiritual journey itself. It's a personal journey. It's an inner journey. It's a journey of self-discovery. It's self-study. You can see it in the way in which manifestation has become one of the defining spiritual virtues of our time. Attract what you want, create your own reality, align your vibration with your best life. You can see it in how much modern psychological and spiritual work is devoted to understanding our wounds, going deep into the history of our pain, becoming experts in our own damage. And you can see it in how we talk about forgiveness. Contemporary spirituality has largely reframed forgiveness as something you do for yourself. Forgive not because they deserve it. Forgive because you deserve peace. And here we can see it very clearly. The practice of forgiveness is not about them. It's about you. So we've named the disease, the shift from the collective to the individual. We know the root cause of the disease is that the ego is running the agenda and placing the all-encompassing I at the center of everything. We know that this focus on ourselves cuts us off from each other. And while we isolate ourselves, the world grows into a worse and worse place. And this is where we are. So the question becomes, now what, right? How do we fix it? I'll tell you what we tend to do, and then I'll tell you what the Course would have us do. What we tend to do after we've retreated into ourselves is we tend to look out at the world and say, you there, you're the problem. You're doing all these things wrong. You need to fix yourself. We do this with those who are close to us. We tell our parents how much they've damaged us. We do this with our family members on the other side of the political divide. We tell them what's wrong with their views and how they should change. We do this with our spouses continually all day long. We do it with our kids. We do this online, where we angrily point out what's wrong with others and how they should be thinking and how they should be behaving. Everywhere you look these days, everyone's engaged in some uncorked effort to tell everyone else how they need to change. How's it working for us? Of course, we know it's not working. The people on the other side of our political divide don't change. They just feel attacked and become angrier. No one ever wins those arguments online. So we think that the solution is to become more persuasive, to have more evidence, to bring the receipts. And that doesn't work either. Nothing that we do that's driven by anger tends to work. Fortunately, the course has a solution. The course has many solutions, but the one I want to share with you today is from a section in chapter 9 of the text called The Correction of Error. And the gist of that section is that our ego, from its vantage point of the all-consuming eye, has us watching each other like hawks, scanning for what's wrong, what's off, and what needs fixing. And the course is telling us in that section particularly, that is not the assignment. But before it tells us what the assignment actually is, the course does something really useful by describing what it is that we're doing instead. And I want to take a minute with this because this is the program that we're all running in our head, the course says, mostly without realizing it. So see if you can recognize yourself in this program. Here is what the ego is telling you. First, there's 3 stages to what the ego is telling you. The first is that you have to be very vigilant for the errors of others. In the correction of error section, it begins with the line, and I think this is actually demonstrating some of Jesus's sense of humor. The correction of error section begins with the line, the alertness of the ego to the errors which other egos make is not the kind of vigilance the Holy Spirit would have you maintain. And I think we all know what he's talking about here. We are all constantly going through our days looking for the errors of other people. When we're with our partners, when we're online, when we're driving, so much of our thinking is being driven by this that we barely even notice it. So, having been vigilant in your mind for the errors of others, the ego then tells you to perceive those errors as very real and very serious. So that's the second step. Perceive the errors of other people as very real in your mind. The correction of error section says to perceive errors in anyone and react to them as if they were real is to make them real to you. So once the other person's errors become real in your mind, now you can see, well, really, it's now all you see is the errors as the expression of who that person is. And the section the course uses, in the section, the course uses language like you attend to the errors of other people and you react to them. Those errors become what you think of when you think of the other person in your mind. So having been vigilant for errors in other people, having made them real in your mind, the third step is you point out the errors to the other person and make sure that they know that they need to correct that error. So the section says, to the ego, it is kind and right and good to point out errors and quote unquote correct them. How can the person ever change their errors unless they're made aware of them? And thank God they have you to tell them what their errors are so they can at last see what they're doing wrong and fix it once and for all. If you've ever been married, or again, if you have children, you know how well this works out, which is to say, it never works out. But the course takes it further still by saying that when we're busy vigilantly looking for error in other people, when we're perceiving that error as real, when we're pointing that error out to them and attempting to correct it, we aren't dissolving their ego. We're strengthening our own. We are pointing out all the ways that their ego is wrong and how they're coming from their ego. But the course says the only way you can do that is when you're coming from your ego. That section says, if you point out the errors of his ego, you must be seeing him through yours, because the Holy Spirit does not perceive his errors. So I had an example of this myself on a walk the day before yesterday, where Robert and I were talking about someone who I have never met, never spoken to, never emailed, but who has said very unkind things about me. And we were on our walk, and I'm saying to Robert, that is so judgmental. It's so bitter. It's so mean. And then it occurred to me, wait a minute, I am actually doing the very thing that I'm accusing this person of. I'm being mean and judgmental about someone I've never met. The very things I was just saying about this other person, I'm doing it. So while I'm over here trying to righteously check her ego with my ego, the only thing that's really happening is that the world is growing more saturated with ego. So again, how much of our days do we spend in this particular churn of ego thinking without even realizing it? Being very vigilant for the errors that other people make. Perceiving those errors is very real, very serious in our mind. Pointing those errors out to the other person, making sure that they know exactly how they can correct their errors. And the Course says, again, this is not the kind of vigilance that the Holy Spirit would have you maintain. From a Course perspective, it's the exact opposite. The vigilance of your mind is meant to be used in service of seeing truly versus seeing error. That's the solution that the Course gives us. The real problem from a Course perspective is never the specific error the other person is making. The real problem is that they have confused themselves with their ego. They think the ego is who they are, and we think their ego is who they are. And everything the ego says and does, every error, every cruelty, every insane political position flows from that one fundamental mistake. They think the ego is who they are, and we think their ego is who they are. And the Course puts it plainly. His ego is always wrong, no matter what it says or does. But we're not going to win by playing the game of whose ego is better. And the goal isn't to win anyway. The goal is to heal. And we heal when we dissolve our ego versus strengthening it. Otherwise, we're in this game of you're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. And we wonder why nothing ever changes. While we keep going round and round on this cycle of telling other people how we think they need to get better, all that really happens is that the hate in the world just grows and the resentment in our relationships just grows. And so what the Course is asking us to do instead is to take all of that energy, all of that vigilance, all of that attention, all of that focus that we've been pouring into people's errors and their mistakes, and put it somewhere else entirely. To put all of that vigilance onto seeing who they truly are. The Course says he is still right because he's a son of God. And so what that means is even if he's making no sense, even if everything coming out of his mouth is ego, even if the facts he's citing aren't facts at all, he is still right because he's a son of God. You don't tell him that his words are right. You don't pretend the error isn't happening. This is not about denial or removing accountability. I do want to be clear about that. This is about finding a way through your face, through your tone, through your actions, through your love, to communicate that you see something in this person that his ego can't touch, something that is not up for debate, something that is not changed by anything that he says or anything that he does. The Course says that when a brother behaves insanely, you can heal him only by perceiving the sanity in him. The Course doesn't say, when a brother behaves insanely, you can heal him only by pointing out and correcting the insanity in him. It says you can heal him only by perceiving the sanity. So let's think about what that means in practice. I'll stick with the example of political views. Your sister is talking about her political views and you think they're completely wrong. You can see that she's repeating things that aren't true. And your playbook, your old playbook, is to correct her, to show her the evidence, to tell her how wrong she is, to point out her errors. And what the Course says is stop doing that. Stop reacting to the errors. Realize that the problem is not the words that are coming out of her mouth. The problem is that she thinks she's an ego when in fact she's a son of God. And then your job at that point is to find your way through the conversation by seeing her as a son of God and demonstrating love to her through your words, through your demeanor. You can tell her that you love her with your eyes, with your patience, with your willingness to stay in the conversation. The message that you give her is that her political views are beside the point. The point is that she is a son of God. She is still right because she's a son of God, and that's the only thing that matters here. Now, I know, you might be thinking that this sounds like denial or avoiding the problem and that there's no way that this can work. But I want to push back on that by saying, how much is our hate working? How much is our browbeating working? How much is our evidence and our reasoned logic working? So maybe we should try loving each other instead. Because if the goal was to change the other person, we should all know by now that the only thing that really changes us is love. If you want to change something, you love it. This is a little personal, but Robert didn't really want me to share this story, but I will anyway. When we got together, we were at different places in our lives. I was pretty mistrustful of relationship, and he was just happy we were together. And I remember one day I was upset about something or other that he had done, and I was complaining about it, and I was angry. And he just looked at me and he said, I want to be upset with you, but I'm just entirely too happy. And in that moment, everything that I was frustrated about just kind of melted away. It didn't feel like he was being dismissive. It actually was really funny. He just wasn't having what I was giving. And we have repeated that line to each other countless times ever since. Like, I want to be upset with you, but I'm just entirely too happy. So I'd like to close by bringing you back to the story that I shared at the beginning of the sermon about my two friends who dropped everything to show up for me when my world fell apart. And as I think about what they actually did that day, they didn't sit me down and tell me what I'd done wrong. And believe me, there was plenty to say on that level. They didn't point out my errors and tell me where I needed to change. They didn't correct me. They just said without saying it, you are still good and we still love you. And I was thinking about this when last winter, when we were watching the news and we were watching the ICE raids in Minnesota. We were watching the protests, and there was this woman I will never forget. The reporter goes up to this woman who's in a march, and the reporter says, "It is below freezing out here. Why are you marching?" And the woman, she was really militant about it. She was like, "It's not cold. It's balmy. We're here to support our neighbors. That's what we do." And I love that. I love that so much. I will never forget that woman. That is moving from I to we. We are here to support our neighbors. That's what we do. That is what's going to heal things more than our legislation, more than our course quotes, more than our self care, more than understanding our wounds more deeply, more than protecting our energy or attracting a better life. What's going to heal is when we can look at the person in front of us, the one with views we can't stand, the one who hurt us, the one who betrayed us, the one who is behaving absolutely insanely, and see that underneath it all, they are still a son of God. And then to treat them as if that's the only thing that's real. To see that as the only thing that's true in them, even when everything on the surface is telling you otherwise. And again, I'm very aware that the ego will tell you this is naive, that the ego will tell you that the stakes are too high, the other side is too wrong, the world is burning too fast, and things are entirely too urgent for this kind of approach. The ego will tell you that the world needs your corrections. The world needs your vigilance and your righteous anger and your righteous attention on everything that's broken. But the ego has been running that program for a long time now. And look at where we are. We have tried to correct each other into change and healing, and it has not worked. So let's try something the Course says actually does work. Let's get back to loving each other. Let's get back to caring about each other. Let's get back to showing up for one another because that's what we do. There's a Son of God in every person you will encounter today. And that Son of God is still right. So let's go find him.